and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I am talking about Elton John's memoir, which is titled Me. It was released in 2019, and I'm comparing it with his biopic, Rocket Man, which was also released in 2019 and is directed by Dexter Fletcher. And I am wearing this shirt in the spirit of Elton John, which of course, by Elton John standards, this would not be considered loud or extravagant or, wild by any means. But still, it is, sparkly and flashy and more in the spirit of Elton John than what I normally would wear. And then obviously, so this book and this memoir came out in the same year. So obviously this movie is not an adaptation of this book, but they're both about Elton John's life, obviously. So it still works to compare one with the other. So beginning with a book review, this memoir was amazing. Highly recommend. I didn't give it 5 stars. I'm trying to be more selective because I feel like last year and in the past, I gave 5 stars out more willy-nilly. So this year I'm trying to be more selective, being like, is it, really a 5-star book? I guess ultimately I gave this 4 stars. Maybe it's a 4.5, but I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't be too picky and just say it's a 5-star book. But this was ghostwritten. So it was ghostwritten by a guy named Alexis Pedridis. And I don't know how the ghostwriting process works. I would imagine that Alexis Pedridis spent a lot of time with Elton John and recorded the conversations and looked at his past journals and whatever and compiled this to write a book that is in the voice of Elton John, right? So assuming that is the case, and this is written as Elton John, even if it's not Elton John, but if it is written with his attitude and his voice, then Elton John has a great sense of humor because this book was hilarious. And I will be sharing different quotes from the book throughout this episode, which give you a look into just his dry, witty sense of humor. And it was also just so well written and so well articulated, and he expresses himself just so clearly. And I didn't know much about him before reading this memoir, and I had never seen Rocket Man before. So I knew the basic things about him, but I loved learning more about him. It gave me a bigger respect for him, even a more appreciation for him. And I already knew he was incredibly talented, right? Because I've heard so many of his songs. And yeah, it just gave me a new level of appreciation for him as a person. And he was just so honest and vulnerable as well. And so, yeah, this was just an incredible memoir. And when it comes to memoirs, celebrity memoirs in particular, this was amazing and I loved it. And I did go back and forth between reading it and listening to the audiobook. And the audiobook is narrated by Taron Edgerton, who plays Elton John in Rocket Man. And yeah, he was a great narrator. So I enjoyed physically reading it as well, and there was a lot I highlighted, so I'm glad I did have the physical copy as well. But if you decide to do the audiobook route, this is a good audiobook. On to the movie review. So like I said, I had not seen this before. It has been on my to-watch list literally ever since it came out, but I just have not gotten around to it until now. And yeah, I should have seen this sooner because this movie was so good. And something I did not realize was that most musical biopics, the music is when the person is performing, right? Whereas this movie is a musical. So it's not just when he's performing. We'll see a scene between characters and they'll sing one of Elton John's songs that fit what is happening in that scene. Even if the song wasn't written about this moment, the lyrics fit with what's happening. And so then, they break out in song as they're dealing with whatever it is they're dealing with. And there's also a lot of choreographed dance scenes as well. So I was not expecting that. I thought it was a great way to do this movie. And yeah, I just really love the setup of that. And for an example, so Bernie, who is his songwriting partner, there's a point where Bernie steps away and he's like, I need to leave right now and take a break from you because Elton John's addictions were getting out of control. And so as they're dealing with this, they start singing Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. And even though Yellow Brick Road was not written about their separation, the lyrics still just fit so well in that moment. And so yeah, I just loved how they did that. And this also has magical realism at times too, because there's a scene where Elton John is performing at the Troubadour and he starts floating and the audience starts floating, and it was just a great way to visually show what it felt like to be there in that moment. So having that magical aspect at times was another really cool part of this movie. And I will say this movie, as all biopics, none of them are 100% factually accurate, and they love to have a villain, which we'll get to, which even in real life, they love to make someone even more of a villain when it comes to a movie. And yeah, certain details aren't accurate, and certain songs, maybe they're singing it, but it's that actually was released earlier or that was released later. So all these little details might not be accurate, but it still gives you a look into Elton John as a person and his life. So it still does what I want a biopic to do, right? I still learned about him and I still got a feel for who he is as a person. But I do have to talk about Taron Edgerton, who plays Elton John. He was incredible, and everyone in this movie was fantastic, but they do their own singing. So Taron Edgerton is doing his own singing and it was amazing. And obviously all these roles are important, but to really nail a biopic, like the main person needs to be spot on, and he was incredible as Elton John. And also, I did want to say that this movie is rated R, which surprised me because it was like not, I didn't get why it was rated R, to be honest. There's no nudity, there's no like graphic sexual content. They say the F word a handful of times, but that's it. We do see him, doing cocaine, so maybe because that is a harder drug, maybe that was why they wanted it rated R. But yeah, so I was surprised that since it's rated R, it was actually not that bad as far as the rating goes, and it take away a few F words, and I feel like this could have been PG-13. But anyway, before I get into the differences between book and movie, I would recommend both of these. Highly, highly recommend both of them. I love them both. You should go check both of them out. And now I will be getting into the details of the book, of the movie, of Elton John's life. And this is where I normally do a spoiler warning, that there will be spoilers for the rest of the episode. That feels funny to say with a biography, because he's so famous and you kind of know where things end up going if you know anything about Elton John. But nonetheless, spoilers from here on out for the rest of the episode. So to begin with his childhood, so Elton John was born Reginald Dwight. He grew up in a home where his father was often away because his father was in the military. And when his father was home, father and the mother were often arguing, and they both just had a horrible temper. And even when the father was gone, Elton John still just lived in fear, essentially, because his mom, even without the father, had such a horrible temper. And a quote from the book reads, talking about how his mom was a scary person, he says, "If she liked to scare people, she must have been overjoyed by me because I was terrified of her. I loved her, she was my mom, but I spent my childhood in a state of high alert, always trying to ensure that I never did anything that might set her off. If she was happy, I was happy, albeit temporarily." And like I said, both parents had a terrible temper. And so as Elton John, when he grew up, he also had a horrible temper and would just fly off the handle. And he says how he thinks it's partly genetic, like he inherited a bad temper, but also because he was raised around people who were always getting upset and always so angry that he also learned by example. So a mix of both nature and nurture going on there. But his parents did officially divorce when his mom met a guy named Fred, and she ended up leaving her husband to marry Fred instead. And he goes to live with his mom and Fred, and from here his relationship with his dad is just very spotty and he doesn't see him too much. And his dad also just hates rock and roll, which Elton John was obviously very passionate about that as he was growing up. And as he continued on his musical career, the father was just always against that. And so they just had a very strained relationship throughout his whole life. But yeah, his mom, and he calls Fred Durf, which is Fred in reverse. So he lived with his mom and Durf even got him a job, like a gig, playing at the local pub. And Durf would like go around collecting money, tips, and then give it to Elton John so he could use it to buy more albums and other things. And the movie does show this. We see him playing at a local pub, and we see him running out through the window, which that did happen because fights would break out at the bar, and Elton John would have to escape out the window in order to not get injured in this fight. And even though he had a better relationship with his mom than he did with his dad, it still was a difficult relationship because, like I said, they both had tempers, but he says how his mom in particular just never apologized, and he was always the one having to apologize to his mom. And there was even a stint there where they didn't speak for 7 years. And this was later in life, and during those 7 years, he had 2 children, but she was just not interested in even meeting her 2 grandchildren. And yeah, like I said, the relationship with his father was very strained. And something the movie doesn't show is that the father was very into football, aka soccer. And so Elton John was also obsessed with football. And eventually, when he was older, he bought a football team. And this passion of football was like the one way where he and his father could connect and bond. And there's a quote that reads, talking about football, "It's one addiction I've never shaken because I never wanted to. It was hereditary, passed on to me by my dad." And I love that line in particular because, he talked about anger being something hereditary that was passed on by both parents and the strain his relationship with his father had. And so the fact that he wants to hold on to this quote unquote addiction, this passion of his, which is football. And one of the reasons he wants to hold on to it is because he feels like it's, the only positive connection he has to his father. And so that's why it's something so special to him, not just because he loves football, but because he feels connected to his father in a positive way through football. And yeah, the movie doesn't get into that at all, like him buying the football team or anything. And the football team was a huge part of his life. He just loved working with them and they treated him like a normal person. He didn't, they weren't a bunch of yes men, which in his musical career, he was surrounded by yes men for a time who just treated him differently. Whereas when he was working in football, they treated him like anybody else. But yeah, going back to his dad, the movie has a great scene where we see him go see his dad when he is an adult. And the dad has a new family now with these two sons who he clearly cares about and is very close to. And Elton John just is heartbroken by this, right? Because on the one hand, it's good that his father has changed for the better, but he was never that for Elton John. And even when he goes to see him, the dad asks for his autograph and he makes it out to his dad, but the dad is like, oh, it's not for me, it's for my coworker. Can you make it out to this guy? And just how he craved a close relationship with his father, but his father was just always so distant. And that was in book and movie. But also in the movie, they combine this with afterwards, he calls his mom, and this is when he tells her that he's gay, and she replies being like, oh, I've known that for years. Just know that you're choosing a life of loneliness. And so that is also in book and movie. And in the movie, I feel like that scene was even more just sad and just not being rejected by his family, but just how they didn't give him the love and encouragement that he was seeking. And there's a part when he's a kid where he says to his dad comes home and he's like, when he's a child, he's like, aren't you gonna hug me? And the dad is like, don't be soft, blah, blah, blah. And so he just didn't receive that love in his home from his mom or his dad. But moving on to his career, so I'm actually not going to spend too much time talking about his career, but in both, in real life as well as in the movie, he auditions to be part of this band, but he doesn't get the part. However, the manager feels bad for him, and so he just has this office that is just a mess, and the guy just seemingly randomly picks up an envelope and he's like, here, check out this guy, because Elton John is good at writing the music, but he has trouble with the lyrics. And so this guy is like, oh, this guy writes lyrics, here you go. And this is a huge moment. The book starts with this moment where he receives this envelope because it was such a huge thing in his life, and in the movie we see it in slow motion because this envelope has the lyrics and the name of Bernie Taupin. And when he reads Bernie's lyrics, he just immediately connects with it, and the music just flows, and he immediately knows what tune to write, what music to go along with these lyrics. And then when the two of them meet, they just immediately hit it off. And obviously it was life-changing for both of them because so many of their hits, it was a combined effort where they were both writing those songs together. So they not only became this incredibly successful songwriting duo performers, Bernie Taupin doesn't perform. But anyway, they're also just lifelong friends. They were roommates at one point, and they even wrote a song for Rocket Man that was in the movie, which won an Oscar. And before recording their own album, they did try to write songs and then sell their songs to other people. However, they did not have good luck with that. And then eventually they just started recording their own albums, and before long, they just took off and were incredibly famous in the UK and then the US, and then before long, it was the whole world. But I did love, these up-and-coming scenes in the movie where he is playing backup for a soul singer, which is, that's in book and in movie, although in real life, he was backup singer for Long John Baldry, whereas in the movie, I don't know if they say the name of the singer he plays for. But yeah, all of that stuff with him meeting Bernie and how they connected, and then them going to LA for the first time, and so all of those up-and-coming scenes I really liked. And for the most part, it was accurate to real life. But before he got famous, he actually got engaged to a woman. And so he and Bernie moved in with this lady, which the movie shows, and they were living with this woman. And the guy he plays backup for, which, like I said, in real life, it was John Baldry. And then in the movie, it's this other guy. But anyway, this guy is gay, and he asks him to be his best man. And in real life, he meets just with this guy, and the guy, he's talking to him about his wedding, and then the guy eventually is just like, what are you doing? You can't marry her. You don't love her. You're gay. And Elton John concedes that, yes, he doesn't love her, and he feels trapped, and he wants out of this relationship, but it keeps progressing, even though he doesn't want it to. He doesn't know whether or not he's gay, but he does end up breaking up with that woman because he just can't go through with it. And then later on, obviously, he does realize that he is gay. And when he was 23, so he was a late bloomer to begin with, and throughout his teenage years and early adult years, he just had zero interest in sex and was very naive. But then when he was 23, he met John Reid. Actually, I think he had known John Reid before, but John Reid was a music manager, and he sees him after some concert in San Francisco, and he ends up losing his virginity to John Reid, and then soon after, they end up dating. And then also, while they're dating, he asks John Reid to be his manager. And John Reid was like a very aggressive person, and he was known for punching people, like reporters and people he worked with, and throwing things, and just being a very difficult, abrasive person. And he also sleeps around a lot too and is constantly cheating on Elton John. But Elton John puts up with this because he loves him, and it is not until John Reid hits Elton that he ends up breaking things off with him. However, he's a good manager, so he keeps him as a manager for decades. And so for the majority of their relationship, it was a working relationship where he was his manager, and it went well. Whereas the movie definitely portrays John Reid as the villain of this story and is very dislikable and very manipulative, even after they break up. Whereas, yeah, in real life, they had an amicable relationship, even post-breakup. However, at the end of the book, Elton John realizes that his finances are not in a good place, and they tell him he's going bankrupt, and he's like, how can that happen? Yeah, he spends a lot, but he also makes a lot of money. And basically John Reid had been stealing from him, so he fires John Reid, of course. So, in hindsight, John Reid wasn't a great manager because he was being shady, but in the moment, he thought he was a good manager and they'd had a good relationship. But yeah, the movie just, like I said, it definitely makes him out to be the villain, which in every musician biopic movie, the manager is always the villain, right? And even in real life, you always hear about musicians being manipulated and their managers are stealing from them and manipulating them and doing all these terrible things. It's who's a musician that has a good manager relationship, right? Because they all just seem to be a nightmare. Anyway, so moving on to his addictions though. So early on, he's in his 20s. He walks in and sees John Reid doing cocaine. John Reid asks him if he wants some, and he's like, yeah. And despite making him throw up the first time he did it, from there on out, he shortly became a coke addict. And when thinking about why he kept doing coke, even though it made him throw up the first time he tried it, it reads, "So why didn't I leave it at that? Partly because throwing up didn't stop the coke affecting me, and I liked how it made me feel. That jolt of confidence and euphoria, that sense that I could suddenly open up, that I didn't feel shy or intimidated, that I could talk to anybody. That was all crap, of course. I was full of energy. I was inquisitive. I had a sense of humor, and I had a thirst for knowledge. I didn't need a drug to make me talk to people. If anything, cocaine gave me too much confidence for my own good." And so I love how he talks about the reasons why he kept doing the drug, but he follows that up with, empowering thoughts about how he actually didn't need it, though, to be a better version of himself and more social and more confident. He already had that within him anyway, right? He didn't need the cocaine or the alcohol. And I think that's one thing every addict needs to learn, right? Because there's a time when they think that the drug or the alcohol, it makes them better and they're just looser and more able to open up. But they always had that inside them, right? And so realizing that you don't need that substance to be a better version of you, you being sober is the best version of you, and having that confidence and that self-love to know that you don't need a substance. By the way, this sticker is pretty small. I recently got this though. It says normalize sobriety. So I thought this was a good episode to put that sticker up. And I do love talking about addiction recovery on this show. I have multiple books and movies that deal with it, that I get into it. And yeah, just normalizing sobriety, right? No matter what the reason is someone doesn't drink, whether it's because they're a recovering alcoholic, maybe their parents were alcoholics and so they don't drink because they don't want to risk it. Maybe it's their religious beliefs. Maybe they don't like the way it makes them feel. Maybe they're just focusing on their bodily health, and alcohol literally poisons your body. And so maybe someone is just trying to be more health conscious, right? There are so many reasons why a person might not be drinking, and how we should normalize that, right? Not be like, oh, why aren't you drinking? As if they're a freak or a weirdo or something's wrong with them because they don't drink, right? Normalize sobriety and not making a big deal of it just because someone chooses not to drink. Anyway, but he also says after he gets sober how he can't be around people that are doing cocaine, partly because he doesn't want to be tempted. But also he says how cocaine makes a person become an arsehole. He's British, obviously. And how that's how he was too when he was on it. And it's something he wished he would have realized earlier. But there is a funny segment about, as his addiction progresses, it got to the point where he used to wait and do it at the end of the day once they were done working. But it got to the point where he was doing it all day long, and it made it into the studio as well. And so there's a line that reads, "I had always tried to be strict about not using drugs in the studio, but this time that rule went completely out of the window. The coke had precisely the impact on my creative judgment you might expect. I stuck any old crap on Leather Jackets being the name of the album. There were old outtakes, songs that weren't good enough for earlier albums, but that after a couple of lines of coke, I suddenly recognized as lost masterpieces the public needed to hear as a matter of urgency." And in the book and movie, his drug and alcohol use obviously gets out of control. And in the book, we hear about 3 different suicide attempts. The first one being when he was engaged to that woman before he was famous, before he was doing drugs. But once he's famous and doing lots of drugs, he attempts suicide twice by overdosing on pills. And we see one of these in the movie. And in the movie, it plays out how it was in real life, where his family was in town and they were in LA. And the mayor of LA had deemed it Elton John week, and he had 2 shows at Dodger Stadium. And so basically, like, from the outside, it seemed like things were great, right? He was rich and successful. It was Elton John week in LA. He was performing at a sold-out Dodger Stadium twice. And yet he tries to commit suicide, and he says how he takes a bunch of pills and then he goes out to where the people are and he announces that he's going to kill himself, and then he jumps in the pool. But he says how in the book, the reason he did that was because it was his cry for help, right? Because he didn't know how to articulate to those he loved, I need help. And so the only way he could show it was by doing a suicide attempt. And he didn't like actually want to die, and that's why he made it so public and announced it, and people were able to help him. So he didn't actually want to die, but he just wanted to get people's attention and for them to see that he was not okay. But in both, even after the suicide attempt, his concert is the very next day, and he goes out there and gives a great performance despite his suicide attempt the day prior. And I did want to say how in the movie, it starts out with him walking into an addiction recovery meeting and telling them his story and why he turned to drugs and why he needs help. And so the movie is framed in that narrative where we get flashbacks to his life, and then we'll return to him in this addiction recovery meeting as he's reflecting on his life. And so I love the way the narrative was framed in that way. And I also loved how right from the start, his addiction is definitely a focus in the movie, because the movie ends once he's sober, whereas the book, it continues on even after he's sober. But the movie really focuses on that. And they tell you right from the start that that's going to be the focus because we're beginning in an addiction recovery meeting. And then to talk about getting sober, so in the movie, he voluntarily checks himself into a rehab, whereas in the book, he was dating a guy named Hugh, and Hugh was doing a lot of drugs and drinking, and Hugh tells him, like, I need to get help. I'm going to go to a rehab because I have a problem. And Elton John is very bothered by Hugh saying this because he's like, if Hugh has a problem, is saying he has a problem, then that implies that I also have a problem because we're doing the same thing. And Elton John does not want to admit that he has a problem, so he is very upset at Hugh for saying this. He's very upset at him for going to a rehab, and he just has a bad attitude and is in denial the whole time. Well, not the whole time, because eventually he does go see Hugh at this rehab, and he admits while he's there, he's like, you know what, I need help. And so he looks in to find a rehab that will treat his alcoholism, his drug addiction, and his bulimia, because he has all 3 of those going on. Oh, and his sex addiction as well. And so he finds a rehab to focus on all 4. And one of the chapters, we get the letter he writes specifically to cocaine, which that's common when someone is getting sober. They write a letter to their addiction and to the substance, breaking things off. And I want to share a segment from this letter because it was just so well written. So he's addressing this to cocaine, like I said. When I first met you, you seemed to bring out everything that had been suppressed before. I could talk about anything I wanted for the first time in my life. There was something in your makeup that brought all my walls and barriers crashing down. You made me feel free. I was never jealous if other people shared you. In fact, I liked turning other people onto your charms. I realized how stupid I must have been because you never really cared for me. It was all one-sided. You only cared about how many people you can trap in your web. We had great parties with people. We had a great intense talks about how we were going to change the world. Of course, we never did, but boy, we could talk. All I cared about was myself and you, so I kept you to myself. In the end, I didn't want to share you with anyone. I just wanted us to be alone. I became more miserable because you ruled my life. And he also has a part where he says that being honest was hard, but it was freeing. You got rid of the baggage that came with lying, the embarrassment, the shame. And I've talked about this before, but someone once talked about alcohol addiction, and she said that alcohol was magic, medicine, misery. And so we see that here, right? Where at first it feels magical, like, wow, like I'm this whole new person and thinking you're so much better. And it just feels magical. And then it gets to the point where you need it just to feel normal. And that's where it's medicine. And then it gets to the point where you just feel trapped by it and it has ruled your life. And at that point, you're still doing it, but it just feels like misery. And at this point, before he checked into the rehab, he had a stint where, AIDS was going on. And so he was just very depressed. And so he had a time where he just locked himself in a room and it was just drinking, doing cocaine, and just miserable. And then, how addiction, you often lie a lot. But then once you're honest, it's funny enough, like you would think that being honest would be the more embarrassing, shameful thing. But by suddenly just being honest and open, it's so freeing and you're able to rid yourself of the embarrassment and shame. But another funny part is how after rehab, he and Hugh decide to stay together and get an apartment together. And a quote from the book reads, "They, the rehab people, kept telling us that it wouldn't work, that the dynamic of the relationship would change irrevocably now that we were sober. We both dismissed that as nonsense. So we rented an apartment, moved in together, and discovered to our immense surprise that the dynamic of our relationship appeared to have changed irrevocably now that we were sober and it wasn't working out." And then the first few years of sobriety, he goes to a ton of AA meetings. One month he goes to 100 meetings. However, after a few years, he decided that he was kind of done with meetings. And he says that he got to a point where he didn't want to talk about alcohol, cocaine, or bulimia every day. And I could relate to this too, because as someone who is in Al-Anon, which is Al-Anon is for people who have a loved one who is an alcoholic, the first while when I was going to those Al-Anon meetings was so helpful and life-changing. But then once I started, my own recovery and the alcoholic in my life was recovered, and the longer I kept going, I just was like, I felt like I wasn't getting as much out of it. And I also didn't want to be talking about alcoholism all the time, right? And I felt like I was just dredging up these old memories and these old things that I didn't really feel the need to be thinking about anymore. So I will say maybe if I could have gone to a different meeting, because that meeting was aimed towards people who were newer to the program. So maybe I should have switched the type of meeting I went to. So I'm not trying to be anti-AA or Al-Anon, because obviously I'm very pro that. But I also understand getting to the point where you just don't feel the need to have it anymore. Although strict AA people would strongly disagree and say that you should always be going. But anyway. Speaking of how you should always be going, eventually down the road, his husband, who he later marries, ends up getting sober. And when his husband is sober, the two of them start going to AA meetings again. And so he does start going to meetings again, and he realizes how much benefit there is from going. So even though he had that time where he didn't go, he did end up going again down the road. And like I said, the movie ends when he is sober. So he's in the rehab and he's talking with Bernie, and he tells Bernie how he's worried that now that he's sober, he won't be as talented. And he's like, what if it was all the drugs? But Bernie is like, don't be ridiculous. And he's like, what you're really scared of is just feeling things again. And the movie ends with him doing like a music video recreation of I'm Still Standing. And even though that song wasn't about his sobriety, the song is obviously very fitting for him to come back after sobriety and I'm Still Standing, right? So it's such an empowering, great way to end the movie. I do wish the movie would have showed us more after his sobriety, because so much more did happen in his life, right? So the movie almost makes it seem like, once he gets sober, nothing big happened, so no need to show it. Which they do during the credits, they talk about his life. So they do acknowledge things that happened afterwards. But yeah, I just like that the book continues on post-sobriety and shows all the things that happened after he was sober and just gets more into his sobriety than the movie did. But then to talk about his relationships, I'm jumping back in time here because this is when he was still doing drugs. But so after John Reid, he had various boyfriends through the years, but they never stuck. And they were just always dysfunctional as well. And he had this habit of they would just get swept up in his life. And because he had the money, he would just pay for them to come with him on tour. But then eventually he would get bored with them and have someone else like on his tour, in his group, break things off with the person. So they would just get caught up in this whirlwind and then he would just drop them. And at one point he meets a woman who works in a recording studio and he feels this connection with her and they just have this great chemistry, and he starts thinking that like maybe there's something between them. And in the book it reads, "What if a relationship with a woman could make me happy in a way that a relationship with men had thus far failed to do? What if the fact that I enjoyed Renette, which Renetta is the name of the woman, what if the fact that I enjoyed Renetta's company so much wasn't a kind of affectionate bond between two lonely people a long way from home, but a sudden and unexpected stirring of heterosexual desire? What if I only spent the last 14 years sleeping with men because I hadn't found the right woman yet? What if now I had?" The more I thought about it, the more I thought that it was true. It was a tricky line of argument that didn't really hold up to close scrutiny, or indeed any scrutiny whatsoever. But as tricky as it was easier than facing up to the real problem. Obviously the real problem being him and all the therapy he needed. Anyway, they do end up getting married, and the marriage lasts for 4 years, but eventually they divorce. And in the book, he tells us how when he and Renetta decided to divorce, they had made a promise to each other that they would never speak publicly about their relationship. And they have both held up that promise, and she has never spoken about the details and said anything negative about him. And so in the book, he doesn't give us any details either. All he says is that, she was a wonderful person, and he's just sorry about the whole thing, essentially. Which I liked that he kept that private, right? And so So, but yeah, obviously it's not too surprising it didn't work because one, he was still doing drugs, he was still drinking, and he was gay. And by the way, so he is close friends with Rod Stewart, and throughout this book, we get a lot of funny stories with him and Rod Stewart. But when he got married to Renetta, it was a very quick marriage, and they were in Australia, I think. And so Rod Stewart, he was invited, but he couldn't make it. However, a telegram was sent, which read, the song I'm Still Standing had already been released at this point. And so in this telegram, it says, "You may still be standing, dear, but the rest of us are on the effing floor," because he was so shocked that he was marrying a woman. And some people assumed like, oh, maybe he's marrying a woman because he wants kids. But he says how like, I was still acting like a child at that time. So to have kids, like that was not at all on my mind. So that had nothing to do with him marrying Renetta. But once he is older, I forget how old he was, but he meets a guy named David, and the two of them do end up getting married, and they do have a healthy relationship. And Elton John says how that was an adjustment to have a relationship that was healthy and normal and not full of drama and drugs. And so what a breath of fresh air, but also an adjustment it was to be in that relationship. And then when he was like 60, he finally did decide he wanted to have kids and they were going to adopt, but ultimately they ended up having 2 children through a surrogate. But yeah, he has a lot of funny stories in this book about the relationships he had or interactions he had with famous people, including Rod Stewart, like I said, John Lennon, Freddie Mercury, Princess Diana. And then he has some like funny or interesting and sometimes sad stories about like brief interactions he had with Brian Wilson, Elvis, Michael Jackson, Paul McCartney, Stevie Wonder, the Rolling Stones, and many others. But when he talks about these people, it didn't feel like he was name dropping. First of all, he's Elton John, right? Like he's someone who people would name drop about, right? So he's at that level where it doesn't come across like he's name dropping because he himself is so famous. So when he was talking about these people, it didn't feel like he was bragging. It felt like he was just sharing stories about the people in his life. But before I end this, I couldn't not talk about The Lion King. Obviously, Elton John wrote the music for that movie, and there's a funny line from the book which reads, while he was working on the music for this, it reads, "There were days when I'd find myself sat at the piano thinking long and hard about the path my career seemed to be taking. You know, I wrote Somebody Saved My Life Tonight. I wrote Sorry Seems to Be the Hardest Word. I wrote I Guess That's Why They Call It the Blues. And there was no getting around the fact that I was now writing a song about a warthog that farted a lot. Admittedly, I thought it was a pretty good song about a warthog that farted a lot. Still, it felt a long way from Bob Dylan stopping us on the stairs and complimenting Bernie on My Father's Gun." My Father's Gun is the name of the song, by the way, not his actual father's gun. But he says, "But I decided that something about the sheer ridiculousness of the situation appealed to me, and I carried on." And so even though he had doubts about where he was in his career as he was writing this music, The Lion King was of course a huge hit. Everybody loved the music, the soundtrack did amazing, and it was even turned into a Broadway musical. So that was a funny part of the story. But there was a lot as far as the book goes that I didn't get into because he talks about his experience with AIDS, not him getting AIDS, but just the AIDS pandemic, would it be called pandemic or epidemic that was going on, and the people he knew and loved that had it, and he starts charities for it as well. And he was drinking when that was a thing, and there were people he knew and loved that died. It just encourages his self-loathing because he's like, I'm not doing anything to help. Like, I'm not doing anything, right? And so rather than do something, he just became more and more secluded. However, once he got sober, he did start these different charities and he did go out and do things and make a difference, right? And then we hear more details about his fatherhood and his career, and we even hear him talk about the movie Rocket Man and meeting with Taron Edgerton. So yeah, there's a lot to the book I didn't get to, but I highly recommend it. You should definitely read it, as I already said. And as far as book versus movie, this is so hard because the book, you get more details, of course, and it is more factual, whereas the movie takes some liberties. However, the movie is just so well done, and it is definitely a musical biopic that stands out. And the music is incredible, so you have that too, where you have the benefit of actually hearing Elton John's music as you are watching this movie, whereas the book you don't. And both of them just perfectly capture who Elton John is, and you get such a feel for him as a person and his life experiences. And so the book, I like the book because of all the detail and because you just really get a feel for his personality. But you get a feel for his personality in the movie too. And maybe you don't get all the detail, but that's to be expected, right? The movie is never going to have all the detail of the book. And while the movie is 2 hours, and I would have been totally fine with it being another 30 minutes, even so, it still wouldn't fit all the information you get from the book. But I think each of them, as for what they are, they perfectly execute what they're trying to achieve, right? Like the memoir perfectly achieves what it wants. And then as a biopic, it does such an incredible job. So both of them, for the mediums they are in, they just do an excellent job. And so it's like so hard to choose because they're both so great at what they are, right? And being upset at a movie for not having as many details, I feel like and I've used that excuse in the past, but I'm realizing that's like such an unfair judgment because of course the movie doesn't have as many details, and who wants a movie that has all the details from a book? Like, I don't want that because that would be too much in a movie. And so I feel like that's not a fair way to judge it because they are two different mediums, right? So ultimately, this may be a why the book wins first, but I'm going to say it's a tie. And I absolutely love them both. They are such a great pair together. Yeah, I loved them. Maybe I should give this book 5 stars because I just loved it so much. And yeah, the movie was fantastic. So there you go. A why the book wins first. I'm not going to choose which one I like better, and it is a tie, and I just loved both of them. But anyway, so that wraps it up for this episode. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, you can become a Patreon and support the channel for as little as $3 a month and get access to exclusive content. And then also, if you want to support the channel without donating money, I would also love a podcast rating and review, as well as a subscription to my YouTube channel, as I just said. And also, when people comment on my videos, it makes my day, and I just love chatting with people in the comments about whatever the videos are about. So comment your Elton John thoughts down below and we can talk about him. So thank you so much for watching and listening, and I will see you next time. Bye.